I'm a big fan of behind the scenes stuff. So before we start this morning, I want to take you on a journey, a personal journey. Sometimes I come in here on Saturday before I preach and I kind of walk through some things. And when you're preaching, you got to have a good intro, right? You got to hook everybody or else they're not going to pay attention to you. So I had to walk through a couple ideas. So I'm going to give you some B-sides this morning. I'm going to give you one B-side, but first I got to tell a backstory. This has nothing to do with the sermon, just so you know. Just listen, it's fine. When I was in 7th grade, be careful what you say to kids. When I was in 7th grade, my 7th grade English teacher took me aside one day, and she said, "Zach, I just want you to know, you have a very dry sense of humor," which I know was her way of saying, you're not as funny as you think you are. What's worse, the girl I had a crush on, in the stairwell leaving, I said something I thought was funny to her. She must have heard the teacher. She said, "You have a very dry sense of humor." So here's my intro that I was working on for today. I'm just going to say it without, just as flat as I can. This is my process, right? I was going to say something along the lines of, I'm really glad Lance ran with the ball last week with all the football references because he knew that I would fumble. Yeah, that's good. All right. I knew it would be better if I just told you the process as opposed to stand up here and try to pretend that was good. Yeah, I know. Thank you. I trust you. I respect you all far too much for that. All right. It is Transfiguration Sunday, as you just heard the text read. So our sermon title for today is Transfiguring Our Image of God. In May of last year, I completed a 2-year spiritual direction program. And one of the things that I noticed during my training and afterwards was that not many people know what a spiritual director is, or what spiritual direction is, or what a spiritual director does, which is unfortunate because it's actually quite simple. A spiritual director listens. A spiritual director brings their full attention to you and lets you tell the stories you carry about faith and life without fear or shame or guilt, recounting where you are along your spiritual path, where you want to be, and how you want to continue to grow. A spiritual director listens. The goal of spiritual direction is that through listening, the director may be able to ask questions to help you discern what deeper life God is calling you to. Spiritual direction is not about getting the right answers from the pastor. It's about hearing and discerning the Spirit for yourself. So that is my plug for spiritual direction, if you're interested, but that's not exactly why I bring it up this morning. One of the things that you learn when you are listening to other people's stories is that everyone has an inherited and developing image of God. What I mean by that, not when we say, I have the image of God, or you, I'm talking about our mental, emotional, and spiritual pictures of God that we have. What we think and feel and how we are moved when we talk about God is our image of God. And we all have these mental, emotional, and spiritual pictures of God. They are both given to us. And I was looking at these kids sitting on this floor, and I was like, I'm so happy for the image of God that is being given to these kids in this circle and is being handed to them down in Kaleidoscope. And then we also have the image of God that continues to develop as we mature and as we grow up. In a way, and don't take this the wrong way, but subjectively, there are as many images of God as there are people. That's why sometimes when I'm having a counseling session or a directing session with somebody, and especially somebody who's really frustrated, and they're like, I just don't believe in God. And I'll ask them, well, what God don't you believe in? And sometimes they'll tell me the God they don't believe in, and I'll say, hey, I don't believe in that God either. One of the things that we've learned is that when I say God, and when you say God, sometimes we don't mean exactly the same things. This is important for us to consider. I found this quote this week by Tozer, where he wrote, "Were we able to extract from any person a complete answer to the question, what comes to mind when you think about God, we might predict with certainty the spiritual future of that person. What we think about God, what we feel about God, what we say about God matters. It shapes us and it shapes how we live in this world. It shapes our children. It shapes our culture and our values. And while many of these images of God are positive at best and maybe inoffensive at worst, writer and thinker Frank Powell describes in an article that I read this week how distorted images of God can adversely affect our emotional, mental, spiritual, and even our physical health. For instance, personally, I am increasingly dismissive of any image of God as an angry, violent father figure. Because a relationship, if you can call it that, with that God is often rooted in fear and avoiding punishment, as opposed to being rooted in mutual affection. Some other distorted images of God might be the image of a demanding God. This is the hard-nosed, no-nonsense drill sergeant God who is never satisfied with you no matter how hard you work, no matter how disciplined you are, because you will never be able to measure up. This image of God often leads to a nagging, disabling sense of shame and brokenness that we carry with us our entire lives. It leads to cycles of failure and repentance and despair and failure and repentance and despair, and we waste all of our religious energies attempting to simply measure up. Another distorted image of God is that of a superficial God. This is the God the God of multi-level marketing faith and bumper sticker Christianity. The God who wants us to look busy, doing all the good little Christian things, even if it's superficial and perhaps a little superstitious. This God, this superficial God, this is the buddy Christ, by the way. This God doesn't care if you're angry, bitter, greedy, every day of the week, as long as you go to Sunday school a couple times a month and toss a 10 in the tithe on your way out. Unfortunately, this image of God can create a trivial, shallow spirituality. Then there's the image of a confined God. This is a God of winners and losers, of insiders and outsiders, a God who sits behind walls erected by God himself. And outside those walls are many who are simply less than human and unworthy of God's attention or time. But maybe, just maybe, they can be convinced enough to adopt the right ideas about God so God can squeeze them through. Unfortunately, this confined image of God, history tells us, has often been the image of Christendom, the God of cultural dominance, the God that often leads to being rooted in human ideas and institutions like power and political agendas and racial and ethnic superiority and sexism and violence. We all have an image of God. Some of them are good. Some of them are inoffensive at worst. And yet some of them can be very deadly and damaging to both our souls and the souls around us. A friend and mentor of mine, Reverend Daniel Wolpert, who happens to be a research scientist and a psychologist and a spiritual director, along with some of his associates, used global information systems mapping, which is a tool that allows you to take research of things that are previously uncorrelated and put them together. And he examined the trends of data sets between the negative health outcomes of people and their theology. In Dan's report, he gave it a presentation at a National Integrative Medicine conference, what he revealed in this report was that American states that boasted religious affiliates with the hallmarks of toxic theology, images of God as violent and authoritarian, threats of never-ending torture in hell, a focus on the wretchedness of humanity and the condemnation of certain people groups, American states who boasted religious affiliates with that image of God ranked lowest across all health categories: diabetes, heart disease, obesity, depression, and even child well-being. Were we able to extract from any man a complete answer to the question, what comes into your mind when you think about God, we might predict with certainty the spiritual future of that man. Which brings us to today's text. Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 8. You just heard Brittany read a version of that. It goes like this. Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. And his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. That's such a great line. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with him anymore, but only Jesus. This is the word of the Lord. I was gifted the book on this next slide, A More Christ-Like God, A More Beautiful Gospel by Brad Jersak, for Christmas in 2018. And it has had a profound impact on my personal image of God since then. So I figured I would share some of it with you today. Just a few pages in, the foreword of the book, it's beautiful. It's written by pastor and author Brian Zand. He asked this profound question. You can see it there at the top. What if Jesus is what God has to say? What if Jesus is what God has to say? This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him, says the voice of God. Looking around, they saw no one with them anymore, only Jesus. In this very curious encounter, I love the details that were added in the children's version. I was like, I don't know if that's in the text, but I like it. That's fine. Just make it a little weirder. It's already a pretty strange story. Jesus takes his inner circle, Peter, James, and John, to a high place, because that's where mystical experiences happen in the Bible, in high places. And there he is transfigured in a radiant display. Transfiguration literally means something like changing form in keeping with inner reality. Mark is saying that for the first time, these 3 disciples can see Jesus fully, clearly, brilliantly, exactly as Jesus is. And spoiler, it's exactly as we shall be. And so they have this profound experience, and Jesus is shining like the sun, like a Clorox ad on the mountaintop. And then Moses and Elijah show up, which, again, I like that Brady took the time to be like, hey, these guys have been dead a while, in case you didn't remember that part of the story, which adds to it. And things couldn't get any weirder. The disciples are already experiencing something that no one expected and no one has words for, and there are 0 categories for. And then Peter, in very Peter fashion, decides that he's going to attempt to do something because that's what he does when he doesn't understand. He acts. I don't know if that's how Any of you respond to crisis in your life? I have to fix it immediately. He can't comprehend it. He's sitting there in this mystery, and instead of letting it make sense to him, he decides, he's just so anxious, he's like, I know what we'll do. 3 tents, right? 3 tabernacles. One for you, one for you, one for you. Boom, finished, solved it. But in this frantic race to make sense of everything, it's not even Jesus this time. It's the voice of God from heaven. And he's like, slow down. I'm showing you this for a reason. Pay attention. Peter wants to honor what has been and what is to preserve the moment, but then Jesus is left standing alone. And there's even more going on here, though. For instance, does anyone recall an encounter that Moses might have had like this on top of a mountain? Yeah. Exodus 34. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with Moses and proclaimed the name the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Moses has this profound mountaintop experience with God, and it's a pretty spectacular occurrence. However, it is not without its own limitations, as previously God said to Moses, you cannot see my face, for no one shall see me and live. While my glory passes by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you will see my back. But my face you shall not see. So despite all that, Moses left the mountain with only a glimpse of the divine backside and 2 stone tablets. And then there's Elijah. Does anybody remember a curious incident where the voice of God spoke to Elijah? After Elijah defeated the prophets of Baal and wandered to the very same mountaintop that this story with Moses takes place on. The word of the Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. The Lord is about to pass by. Now there was a great wind so strong that it was splitting the mountains and breaking the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in an earthquake. And after an earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after a fire, the sound of sheer silence. Both of these men of faith have these profound experiences of the glory of God being revealed to them in these ways. Everyone, all of us, have an inherited and developing image of God. Even Jesus' disciples, even Peter, one of Jesus' closest friends, and even figures of the faith like Moses and Elijah. Our images of God are formed in a variety of ways, especially in the cultures and languages and traditions that we are steeped in and our lived experiences. Peter gets a bad rap sometimes. I love Peter because Peter just reminds me of me. He's like, the authors they were like, there's got to be one. It's going to be Peter. It makes sense then that this faithful Jewish man, he would see Moses, representative of the Torah, of the original covenant between God and God's people. And he would see Elijah, representative of the prophets. The prophet's job was to shepherd the people back towards covenant faithfulness. And he would see them alongside Jesus, the Messiah, the representative of the new covenant. And he would say, we've got to take this thing and preserve it. We got to put it down. We got to cover it up. We got to keep it here. We got to stay. We'll have a party. 3 tabernacles. But Peter is shocked, like many of us, to realize that every conception of God that he held, even those handed to him through the Torah and the prophets, lacked fullness, lacked completeness. Dr. James Fowler M. Scott Peck, Brian McLaren, and others have all written about stages of spiritual development. Others use the term stages of faith. And each has contributed their ideas and these different levels of development into the conversation. This incident on the mountaintop with Jesus and Peter, James and John just kind of hovering in the background, and even the stories of Moses and Elijah. This week I was sitting with them because they all seem to highlight something for me. They all highlight how our spiritual development should change, should mature from simplicity to complexity as we grow. And it also verifies that clinging to a system of beliefs or a system of ideas or to certain images of God is not the same thing as having faith. 20th century philosopher Alan Watts wrote in his book, The Wisdom of Insecurity, "The believer will open his mind to the truth on the condition that it fits with his preconceived ideas and wishes. Faith, on the other hand, is an unreserved opening of the mind to the truth, whatever it may turn out to be. Faith has no preconceptions. It is a plunge into the unknown. Belief clings, but faith lets go." I was listening to a song on the way here this morning, and the bridge ends with the lyrics, "We have all our clever beliefs, but we don't want our beliefs, God of peace. We want you." Imagine realizing that even within the Bible, the Scriptures, we have unformed, immature images of God that need to be colored in a little more. They're veiled, hidden, awaiting the mystery to be uncovered by the Anointed One, as Paul writes in 2 Corinthians. Tom spoke this morning about the honesty and the humility and the maturity that it takes to confess, I may not have it all figured out. I may have more to learn. I may have to sit with this a little while longer. I'm way better at building a tent than sitting in the mystery. Well, today is Transfiguration Sunday, and as far as our congregation is concerned, it is the climax of Epiphany. Epiphany begins when the Magi come to visit the Christ child, and the season of Epiphany celebrates and invites us into the mystery of what it means for God to reveal God's self most clearly through Jesus. John 1:18 says, "No one has ever seen God. It is only the Son himself who is close to the Father's heart who has made him known." Colossians 1:15 says, "Jesus is the image," I love that, "of the invisible God. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell." Contemplative writer Carl McColman says, "Christ is the manifestation of God in human form, the Word of God made flesh, the secret of divine love made freely available to all." And in a more Christ-like God, Brad Jerzak writes what the church has always confessed. And this is the statement. When people say, "Why are you a Christian?" this is the statement I would point to. "We regard this life, the life of Christ, as the decisive revelation and act of God in time and space. What if Jesus is what God has to say?" So quickly this morning, I want to talk about the two things that Jesus might have to say to us. If Jesus is what God has to say, then what kind of personality, character, and image of God does Jesus Christ reveal? On the one hand, we can expect this from the angle of Christ's divinity, specifically how he displayed the heart of divine love and obedience. Philippians 2 says, "Though he was in the form of God, he did not consider being equal with God something to exploit, but emptied himself by taking on the form of a slave and by becoming like human beings. When he found himself in the form of a human, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." This is the hymn of Christ's kenotic cruciform love. Kenotic means self-emptying. Cruciform means cross-shaped. If you want to know what God looks like this. A self-emptying, cross-shaped, co-suffering God who took on mortality and tasted death in solidarity with all humanity so that all might be reconciled and made whole. What does Christ's divinity reveal to us about God? Jersak says, it reveals a single-minded willingness to give his life for the sake of the world. Jesus reveals an image of God that does not operate by force or displays of power or coercion, but with love. A God that sees our mess and failure and sin and does not shy away from it, but enters into the very same struggle and adores us in the midst of the mess. Jersak writes, Jesus reveals a God that sees us as we are and heals us with hugs rather than blows. This leads me to explore the kind of personality and character and image of God that we can see revealed in Christ's humanity. And even Jesus, the humble carpenter and preacher from Nazareth, had a favorite image of God, the image of Abba. And my favorite story that Jesus tells about his Abba goes something like this. The wayward son practiced his apology repeatedly before returning to his father's land. But while he was still far off, the father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And they began to celebrate. As we read this and other stories that Jesus told about his Abba, we see a picture of God, an image of God who is so good and so welcoming and so safe. A God who is almost scandalously forgiving and loving, that one might even use the word wasteful or wild. A God that is unsettlingly gracious to those who have been told repeatedly that they are not worth God's time. Author and theologian Keith Giles writes, Jesus revealed a God who would rather die than kill his enemies. A God who absorbed our violence but refused to do any violence to us. Jesus reveals to us a God who embraces reconciliation over retaliation. Yes, Jesus is like God, but God the Father is like Jesus. And that, my friends, is very, very good news. What if Jesus is what God has to say? 1 Corinthians 13, Paul says, "When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now, we see only a reflection, as in a mirror. But then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, as I have been fully known." We all have an inherited and developing image of God that we have both been given and we are growing into. So my question to you is, how does God look? How does God sound? How does God act to you? Demanding? Punitive? Superficial? Or something else? Welcoming? Healing? loving, reconciling? What do you imagine when you close your eyes to pray? What if Jesus is what God has to say? To end this portion of our time today, I'm going to invite us into a few minutes of quiet reflection. You may have noticed that there are images kind of deep in the background of today's slides. I tried to incorporate various images of God, and many of those images were of Christ, the decisive revelation, an act of God in time and space. During our reflection, I welcome you to meditate and focus on one of these images that strikes you, and let it hold your attention. The great Scottish author and minister George MacDonald wrote, "Jesus says, 'I and the Father are one.' Will an earnest heart, knowing this, be likely to draw back? Or will it draw nearer to behold the great sight?" The reality of Christ's nature is not proved by argument. He must be beheld. The manifestation of him must gravitate inwards on the soul. It is by looking that one can know. So Christ must prove himself to the human soul through being beheld. Let us behold together.